When people think of wild animals in North America, a few instantly come to mind. Wolves running through the forest, black bears foraging near campsites, and polar bears roaming the Arctic sea ice. Yet among them, grizzly bears hold a special weight. They're the giants of the mountain valleys, guardians of the rivers. Powerful enough to topple trees, yet vulnerable in ways most never see. For centuries, grizzly bears shaped the landscapes of Montana, Wyoming, and Alaska. They spread seeds as they dug roots, carved trails through forests, and balanced prey populations. But over time, their world shrank. Roads cut through the taiga neighborhoods, edged into valleys, and garbage cans replaced berry patches. And with every mile of wilderness lost, more grizzlies wandered closer to people. That's where conflict begins. In Montana alone, dozens of calls reach wildlife officers each season. A rancher finds a grizzly rummaging through feed. Hikers encounter one on a trail. Families wake to paw prints on their porches. Each case tests how humans respond, relocate the bear, bring it to a sanctuary, or in the worst cases, put it down. Shelters and wildlife rescue centers are overwhelmed. Unlike smaller forest animals that can be quickly rehomed or released, a displaced grizzly often has nowhere to go. Sanctuaries are full, budgets are tight, and public patience is thin. That was the reality facing Samson the bear at the center of our story. He wasn't found in a remote meadow or high ridge. He was spotted near a string of cabins outside Bozeman, Montana, moving slowly through trash piles. At first, people thought he was just passing through a rare sighting to talk about at the diner. But he came back again and again. To some, he was a threat. To others, he looked broken ribs faintly visible. Fur, dull steps heavy as if each day wore him down. It's easy to label a grizzly as dangerous. It takes more to see when one has lost his wildness, not by choice, but by circumstance. Rescuers often say the hardest calls are the ones where they must decide if an animal lives or dies. Grizzly bears are protected, yet every incident stirs debate. Wildlife officers remember one case: a female grizzly in Glacier National Park relocated 3 times before she was finally euthanized after raiding campsites. They knew the public backlash, but they also carried the fear of another human fatality. Samson's case sat on the same edge. One officer admitted, "We weren't sure if anyone would take him. A grizzly that's been near people usually doesn't get a second chance." What if conflict isn't always the bear's fault? Studies from Yellowstone show that nearly 70% of grizzly encounters happen within a half-mile of human settlements, unusually near unsecured garbage or livestock feed. It's not the wilderness pulling bears in, it's people drawing them closer. In that light, Samson wasn't just a problem bear. He was a mirror reflecting our choices. We often imagine wild animals as intruders, but the truth is, we've built into their corridors, fenced over their rivers, and paved through their feeding grounds. Seeing Samson slumped by a dumpster, you realize the line between wild and tame isn't fixed. It bends where survival forces it. Take another example. In the late 1990s, a male grizzly in Wyoming became infamous for breaking into barns. Locals nicknamed him Rusty. Instead of killing him, a sanctuary in Idaho stepped in, building a dedicated enclosure with streams and logs. Rusty lived another 10 years, becoming a quiet ambassador for how second chances can work. School children came to see him, teachers spoke about coexistence, and donations kept the sanctuary alive. That single bear changed hundreds of minds, proof that when communities act with compassion, even an apex predator can teach peace. Samson's story echoes Rusty's, but with a sharper edge. By the time he reached the shelter in Montana, he no longer fought the cage. He simply folded into it, silent. Staff whispered that he behaved more like an abandoned pet than a wild bear. That's the tragedy of displacement. It doesn't just take an animal's home, it takes its will. Watching him, one caretaker said, "It's like he no longer believed anyone would care." That sentence carried the weight of every forgotten giant behind bars. Protecting wildlife isn't just about national parks or conservation laws. It's about daily choices. Securing garbage, supporting animal sanctuaries, and remembering that our backyard is also someone else's habitat. For viewers who feel far removed from grizzly bears, think of the black bear in your town, the fox near your streetlight, the stray dog outside your grocery store. They're all part of the same question. Do we choose indifference or do we choose care? For older viewers, many of whom grew up hearing bedtime stories about wild animals as threats, this shift in perspective matters. The truth is, bears are not monsters hiding in the woods. They are survivors in a world that keeps closing in on them. And survivors deserve more than suspicion. They deserve understanding. That's why animal rescue stories resonate so deeply. They show us not just how to save others, but how to recover the empathy we often forget. Samson's cage could have been the end, but instead it became the beginning of something no one expected. When a staff member snapped a simple photo of him and shared it online, it didn't look like much. Just a tired grizzly behind bars. Yet within hours, thousands of people felt what words couldn't capture. They saw the same sadness, the same surrender, and they wanted to respond. It was as if his silence reached across the internet, shaking strangers awake. With a grizzly once written off as a problem now standing at the edge of possibility, the photo of Samson, dull eyes and drooping fur would become the spark that set his story in motion. From human-bear conflicts to digital compassion, his journey reminds us that giants are never truly forgotten. They're simply waiting for someone to notice. The morning Samson was found began like many others for Montana wildlife officers. A call came in from a cabin owner near the Bridger Mountains. The voice on the other end was sharp, anxious. A grizzly bear was back in the trash again. It wasn't the first call, and everyone knew it wouldn't be the last. The bear wasn't aggressive, but he lingered pawing through garbage bags, ignoring shouts and banging pans. He seemed tired, distracted, less a threat than a shadow. Still, for the people living there, fear outweighed sympathy. One man muttered, "If you don't take him, someone else will." Everyone knew what that meant. By the time officers arrived, Samson was still there, shoulders hunched, nose buried in a pile of discarded food wrappers. He didn't run. He barely looked up. That alone unsettled the team. A healthy wild grizzly should bolt at the first sign of people. One officer whispered, "He's given up." They loaded a tranquilizer dart, not knowing if they were buying him time or sealing his fate. When the dart struck, Samson stumbled, then sank into the ground with a heavy sigh. It felt less like sedation and more like surrender. At the holding facility, staff performed the usual health check. His teeth showed wear, his ribs pressed against his hide, and patches of fur carried scars. He weighed less than a grizzly his age should have. A vet, Dr. Emily, later said, "We weren't sure he'd make it through the night. He had the look of an animal that had stopped fighting." That night, staff rotated shifts, checking his breathing, logging his vitals. Each time they looked at him, the same thought returned. Here was an apex predator once feared, now lying like an abandoned pet. The decision of what to do next divided people. Some argued for relocation deeper into the wilderness. Others said it was useless. Once a grizzly learns to find food near humans, he usually returns. A few leaned toward euthanasia, a word no one wanted to speak aloud but hung heavy in the room. Sanctuaries were crowded, budgets thin. Was there even a place for Samson rescue work is not just about saving lives. It's about making impossible choices with limited tools. For small forest animals like raccoons or foxes, rescue can mean rehabilitation and release. For endangered animals like polar bears, rescue often ties into global awareness campaigns. But for grizzlies, especially those already caught in conflict, options are scarce. Shelters rarely advertise it, but many never get a second chance. The public only hears about the successes. Behind the scenes are files filled with names, dates, and endings that never became stories. One example still lingers with rescuers. Years ago, another grizzly was caught near Big Sky. He was relocated twice, each time returning closer to home. On the third strike, the call came down: euthanize. Officers carried out the order quietly, knowing that if the public knew, outrage would follow. That bear's story never reached social media. He became a statistic, one more loss folded into annual reports. The lesson? Silence often hides the cost of human-wildlife conflict. Samson's case might have gone the same way, unnoticed, unremembered. But fate intervened. One caretaker, Megan, couldn't shake the sight of Samson curled in his cage, unmoving. On a quiet evening, she snapped a photo with her phone. She uploaded it to the shelter's modest Facebook page with a short caption, "This is Samson. He no longer believes anyone cares." She didn't expect much. Maybe a handful of shares, maybe a donation or two. What followed was the beginning of something no one predicted. Where would Samson go if he survived the week sanctuaries were called, all of them hesitant? A grizzly was no black bear cub. He would eat hundreds of pounds of food each month, require acres of land, and need constant supervision. The costs alone would run into thousands annually. And yet voices began to soften when the photo started gaining traction. Comments flooded in. "Please don't give up on him. He deserves a safe place. Tell us how to help. He deserves a..." For the staff who had been quietly debating Samson's fate, those words mattered. Public support can tip the scales in ways data cannot. A vet explained it best: when people care enough to speak suddenly, a bear goes from being a liability to being a symbol. In Samson's case, that symbol was survival against the odds. Many believe viral media is shallow, just likes and shares. But in animal rescue, it can be the difference between life and death. A quiet photo of a lonely bear can draw donations, rally sanctuaries, and convince directors to say yes where they would have said no. Samson's arrival at the shelter could have been a forgotten footnote. Instead, because one worker chose to share his face with the world, his story took on weight. That's the ripple power of compassion multiplied by technology. For viewers, this isn't just a story about a grizzly in Montana. It's a reminder of the fragile thread each animal hangs on once it collides with human life. Samson's near-death rescue shows how quickly the line between existence and disappearance can be crossed. It's a call to see every encounter with wildlife not as a nuisance, but as a test of empathy. And perhaps the lesson is this: sometimes rescue isn't about bold actions, but about hesitation. The pause before pulling a trigger, the moment someone chooses to snap a photo instead of closing a file. That hesitation gave Samson a chance. Without it, his story would have ended quietly, like so many others. As Samson lay in his cage recovering, the staff weren't sure what would happen next. He was alive, yes, but still weak, still uncertain. His future was not secured, only borrowed. Yet outside those walls, his face was already circling through hundreds of screens. People were starting to care. The silence around him was breaking. The night, a simple photo sparked thousands of voices. Samson's story was about to move from obscurity into the open. The viral moment was coming, and with it a tide no one expected. The photo wasn't taken with a professional camera. It wasn't staged, edited, or even planned. Megan, the caretaker who had been feeding Samson, simply raised her phone and pressed the shutter. On the screen appeared a grizzly bear with its head low paws, tucked in, its eyes half closed, as if it had surrendered to the cage. She typed 10 words. "This is Samson. He no longer believes anyone cares." Then she hit post on the shelter's Facebook page and went back to her duties. For a while, nothing happened. A few likes, a handful of shares. That was normal for the page. But by nightfall, something strange began to unfold. Notifications poured in. The photo was shared from Montana to Colorado, from Wyoming to Maine. Comments multiplied so quickly that staff couldn't keep up. Strangers wrote, "His eyes broke my heart," and "Please don't let him die in there." Some left donations right away. $5 or $10 small gestures that added up to something bigger. By morning, Samson's face was everywhere. Animal lovers reposted him on Instagram. Wildlife groups tweeted about him, and even a local newspaper ran a headline, "Sad Grizzly Shark's Outcry." What stunned the staff wasn't just the attention, it was the emotion. People were moved not by his size or his species, but by his sorrow. They weren't seeing a wild animal, they were seeing a soul in need. One example stood out. A retired nurse in Ohio sent a message, "I've never seen a bear in real life, but this picture made me cry. Please tell me how I can help him." Attached was a $200 donation. Another came from a teenager in Seattle who wrote, "I can't adopt a bear, but I shared his photo with all my friends. Maybe someone can." That act alone spread Samson's face into hundreds of new homes. Here's the explanation behind what happened. Viral moments often seem random, but they usually follow a pattern, an image that speaks without words, a story that touches something universal. For Samson, the universality was despair. People know what it feels like to be forgotten. They know what it feels like to lose hope. Seeing those feelings mirrored in a grizzly bear struck a chord that data could never achieve. Compassion is contagious. One share leads to another. One small donation inspires the next. When thousands of people choose to act even in small ways, the combined impact can change the direction of a life. That's what happened here. Samson's photo turned from a simple post into a rallying cry. Yet not every story gets this chance. A week earlier, the shelter had posted a photo of an injured wolf dog. The post gained a few dozen likes and faded. Why Samson? The fresh perspective is that timing and emotion are aligned. A world weary from news of loss and conflict suddenly saw a bear who looked just as weary. Instead of scrolling past, people stopped. They didn't just want to look, they wanted to lift him up. The shelter staff were astonished. They had expected skepticism after all, who adopts a grizzly bear. Instead, they received messages offering hay funding and even transport trucks. Volunteers signed up to clean enclosures. The shelter's donation page, usually quiet, pinged non-stop for hours. What began as one photo transformed into a movement. But there was also a mystery in this sudden wave. Why did people who had never met Samson feel so deeply about him? Some psychologists say it's the mirror effect of animal rescue videos. We project our own fears and loneliness onto creatures who cannot speak. Others argue it's because animals like bears are symbols of strength. Seeing them broken unsettles us more than seeing weakness in smaller creatures. Whatever the reason, the effect was undeniable. Samson had become more than a grizzly bear. He was a story people wanted to rewrite. Of course, going viral doesn't solve everything. Behind the scenes, staff still wrestled with the same questions. Could they find him? A permanent home? Could they manage the costs? Would public interest fade once the next headline arrived? Viral waves are powerful but fleeting. The real work comes after, when emotion must turn into commitment. And yet the ripple effects were already changing things. Sanctuaries that had previously said no began to reconsider. With donations flowing in and public eyes watching, the conversation shifted. Saying we don't have room no longer sounded final. It sounded like a challenge. One sanctuary director in Idaho received dozens of emails from strangers begging them to take Samson. He admitted later, "We were overwhelmed. We weren't planning to expand this year, but seeing the outpouring of support made us pause. We thought maybe we can find a way." That pause, just like Megan's photo, created new space for possibility. For viewers at home, this part of Samson's journey offers a reminder: when you see a story online that moves you, your reaction matters more than you think. A single comment, a share, a donation, each is a vote for compassion. And when enough votes gather, the course of an animal's life can change. Samson, of course, didn't know any of this. He lay in his cage recovering, still unsure of his place. He didn't know that his photo had crossed states or that strangers were debating his future late into the night. But something was happening beyond the bars. His silence had become a voice for thousands. The shelter suddenly faced an adoption race it had never anticipated. Samson was no longer an anonymous bear with no future. Families were writing and filling forms, pleading for the chance to give him a home. Out of those names, one stood out, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. When Samson's photo went viral, the shelter's inbox filled faster than anyone could manage. At first, staff thought most people were just offering encouragement. But then came the unexpected adoption requests. Families from across the country, some with large properties, others with big dreams, all saying the same thing. "We want to give him a home." The truth is, adopting a grizzly bear is not like adopting a dog or even a black bear cub. Sanctuaries must meet strict state and federal regulations. Land fencing, food supply, veterinary access, and long-term funding. Each requirement weeds out most applicants. Still, the shelter received more than 20 serious requests in a single week. The staff realized they were no longer deciding if Samson could find a home. They were deciding who, if anyone, could truly carry the weight of that responsibility. Among those applications, one caught their attention. Daniel, a retired park ranger from Wyoming, and his wife Claire, a high school teacher, had spent decades living near Yellowstone. They weren't strangers to wildlife. They had seen grizzlies on trails, guided campers through encounters, and even lost a hen house once to a wandering black bear. They knew the risks. But their letter wasn't filled with promises to tame or control. It was filled with something else: respect. Daniel wrote, "We don't want to change him. We want to give him space to be who he is safely." That distinction mattered. Many applicants unknowingly revealed a dangerous mindset. They imagined Samson becoming a pet, a companion who would greet them like a dog. One man even wrote that he pictured walking Samson on a chain for the neighbors to see. The shelter dismissed those applications quickly. A grizzly bear is not a trophy or a novelty. He is a wild animal, and even in rescue, his dignity must remain intact. Here's where a small lesson emerges. Too often people confuse love with possession. They see an animal's suffering and believe the solution is to own it, to draw it into their personal orbit. But true compassion sometimes means stepping back, allowing freedom within safety. Daniel and Claire understood that difference. Instead of imagining what Samson could give them, they focused on what they could give him. Still, competition remained fierce. Another application came from a sanctuary in Colorado with vast acreage and proven experience. They argued they were better equipped, and in many ways they were. Their facilities were larger, their staff trained. Yet when asked if they would prioritize Samson, the director admitted they were stretched thin. He would be one of many. For Daniel and Claire, Samson would be the one. The shelter board debated for hours. Voices rose, papers shuffled, pros and cons stacked against each other. One staff member said, "If we send him to a big sanctuary, he'll be safe but anonymous. If we send him to Daniel and Claire, he'll have names who know him." That thought lingered. What Samson needed wasn't just space. He needed presence. Someone who would watch him daily, notice if he grew quiet again, and remind him that care didn't fade with time. Parallel to Samson's case, another animal arrived at the shelter, a younger grizzly caught near a highway. He too had raided trash. But unlike Samson, his photo didn't spread. He sat in a cage, unseen, his future uncertain. Staff couldn't help but compare the two. Viral attention had given Samson choices. Silence left the other bear invisible. That contrast weighed heavily on them, a reminder that for every celebrated rescue, there are countless untold stories. Viral compassion is powerful but selective. It can lift one animal while leaving others behind. The responsibility of sanctuaries is to channel that spotlight, to use the momentum from one story to protect many. That's what Samson's adoption race symbolized. It wasn't just about him. It was about proving that when people care, change becomes possible for more than one. When the decision finally came, it was not unanimous but firm. Samson would go to Daniel and Claire. The board cited their experience, their land, and most importantly, their understanding that Samson was not a pet. He was a survivor who deserved dignity. Staff called the couple to share the news. Claire later described the moment, "I couldn't speak. I just cried. We knew we were stepping into something bigger than ourselves." Of course, the adoption was not instant. There were inspections, permits, and veterinary clearances. Trucks were prepared, enclosures reinforced, and food supplies ordered. Volunteers stepped in, some offering to drive others to donate. The shelter released an update online. "Samson has found a family." The post drew even more shares, thousands of people celebrating, writing, "He finally has a home. And thank you for believing in him." But beneath the joy, there was tension. Could Samson adapt? Would he reject this new environment, or worse, lash out? No one could guarantee success. Daniel himself admitted, "We don't expect gratitude. We just want to give him a chance." That humility steadied the plan. For viewers, here lies another lesson. Adoption, whether of cats, dogs, or rare animals, is never the end of the story. It is the beginning of responsibility. The paperwork is simple. The commitment is not. A family's willingness to embrace uncertainty often defines whether an animal thrives or falls back into despair. And so, as trucks rolled toward the Wyoming property, the world waited. Samson, once an abandoned shelter grizzly, who seemed to believe no one cared, was about to take his first steps into a new chapter. His viral photo had opened the door, but what awaited him on the other side remained unwritten. The morning Samson left, the shelter staff lined the driveway. Some had tears in their eyes, others managed tired smiles. They had done their part, but now the real test began. The truck carrying him rumbled toward Wyoming, toward Daniel and Claire's property on the edge of forest and river. For Samson, it was the first time in weeks he had seen open sky. For the couple waiting, it was the moment when promise would become reality. When the transport finally arrived, the air was still. Daniel walked slowly toward the carrier, not rushing, not shouting, just standing a respectful distance away. He had been around grizzly bears before, but this was different. This time, the bear's survival was tied directly to his choices. Claire stayed back, holding her breath. They watched as the cage door opened. At first, nothing happened. Samson crouched inside the body tense. He sniffed a turn, then sat still. The forest stretched just beyond the gate, green and inviting, yet he hesitated. A staff member whispered, "He doesn't know if it's safe." Minutes felt like hours. Then with a slow push of his paws, Samson stepped forward, one foot then another. The ground was soft. The air carried scents of pine and river. He lowered his head, pawed at the dirt, and looked around as if testing the possibility of freedom. That first step was small, but it mattered more than anyone could measure. In animal rescue, milestones often seem ordinary. A first meal, a first toy, a first nap in peace. Yet for creatures who have lost trust, these moments are breakthroughs. Samson's first step was not just movement, it was belief returning piece by piece. Within hours, he explored the enclosure, built just for him. It stretched across several acres with trees to scratch against a pond, fed by a mountain stream and a sturdy fence marking the boundary. Daniel had insisted on building it himself with help from volunteers, saying, "If we want him to feel safe, we need to show him we prepared for him." The first meal came next. Staff laid out salmon berries and a mixture of grains. Samson approached, slowly, sniffed, and ate. It was not frantic, it was deliberate, as though each bite was proof that hunger would no longer define him. Later that day, he discovered a hollow log left as enrichment. He nudged it with his snout, then rolled it, pausing as though surprised by the sound. For the first time in weeks, staff saw curiosity flicker in his actions. Here's the explanation behind why these moments matter. Wild animals in sanctuaries are not being tamed, they are being stabilized. Freedom in this sense does not mean returning to the mountains. It means having space to act like themselves without fear of retaliation. For grizzly bears, that includes exploring, digging, fishing, and resting in places that mimic their natural environment. Samson's first steps into his enclosure signaled that his instincts were still alive, waiting for the chance to resurface. One example from another rescue shows the importance of these beginnings. Years ago, a black bear cub named Luna was taken into a sanctuary in Minnesota after her mother was killed by a car. For weeks, she refused to eat. Then one day, the staff left a pile of apples. Luna pawed at them, picked one up, and carried it to a corner. That simple action marked her turning point. She survived, grew strong, and eventually became an ambassador for conservation programs. The lesson is clear. First steps may look small, but they carry entire futures inside them. For Samson, his first nap by the pond was that kind of moment. As the sun lowered, he lay down, stretched his paws, and closed his eyes. No bars, no concrete, no crowd of voices. Just water flowing nearby and wind moving through the trees. Daniel watched quietly, whispering, "He trusts the ground enough to sleep." Here's a fresh perspective to carry forward. We often measure progress in grand ways. Acres saved, populations counted, dollars raised. But for animals like Samson, progress is sometimes a paw print in the dirt, a bite of food, a nap in peace. Those are not just symbols, they are lifelines. They remind us that healing begins with the ordinary, repeated until it feels normal again. Of course, not everything was smooth. That first night, Samson startled at every sound. He paced the fence line, tested the edges, and growled softly at the rustle of leaves. This was natural. Freedom comes with uncertainty. Claire recalled watching him and realizing trust isn't built in a day. It's built step by step, the same way he walked out of that cage. When adopting or rescuing animals, whether it's a cat from a shelter, a stray dog, or a grizzly in a sanctuary, patience is not optional. It is the foundation. Expecting instant gratitude or immediate adaptation is a mistake many make. True rescue requires waiting, watching, and honoring the pace of the one being rescued. As days turned into weeks, Samson's daily milestones began to stack up. He learned where the feeding station was. He rolled in the grass after a rainstorm. He even splashed in the pond, sending water flying as Daniel chuckled softly from a distance. Each action ordinary to a wild grizzly became extraordinary here because it showed life returning where despair had been. What goes through an animal's mind in those first moments of freedom? We cannot know for certain, but perhaps the answer isn't about knowing. Perhaps it's about noticing. Watching Samson sniff the air, paw at the soil, and lie beside the water reminds us that presence itself is enough. To witness is to honor. And so Samson's first steps into freedom did more than mark a new chapter for him. They reshaped the lives of Daniel and Claire, and by extension, every person who had followed his story online. Thousands of strangers who had once only seen a sad photo now saw glimpses of recovery. Their compassion had carried him here. His steps carried their hope forward. What happens after the first steps? That is where the story deepens. Freedom is not just stepping out of a cage, it is learning to trust again, to connect, to risk vulnerability. For Samson, the question became, could he let people near without fear? Could he form bonds strong enough to replace the loneliness that once defined him? The first weeks at Daniel and Claire's property were filled with hesitation. Samson stayed near the far edges of the enclosure, pacing along the fence line, watching but never approaching. He accepted food, but only after Daniel had walked away. He rested by the pond, but the moment a gate clicked shut, his ears twitched, his muscles tightened. It was clear freedom had opened the door, but trust had not yet crossed it. Daniel decided his role was not to push, but to wait. Every morning, he carried food to the feeding station and placed it down slowly, speaking in a calm voice. He never lingered. He left space knowing that trust grows in silence more than in force. Claire often watched from the porch, noticing the pattern. Samson would wait ears forward, and only when Daniel disappeared would he walk to eat. Day after day, the ritual repeated. Then came a turning point. One morning, as Daniel laid the food and turned to leave, he felt eyes on his back. He glanced sideways. Samson had already stepped forward, only a few yards away. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding. He was simply watching. Daniel froze, not out of fear, but respect. He whispered, "It's okay, big guy. I'll stay right here." Samson sniffed the air, then bent down to eat while Daniel stood within sight. That was the first shared moment without walls of distance. Why does this matter? For grizzly bears, survival often depends on suspicion. In the wild, they trust only their instincts. In sanctuaries, learning to accept human presence without fear is a milestone. It means the animal has shifted from viewing people as threats to seeing them as part of their environment. It doesn't erase the wildness, but it allows care to reach where it's needed. There are examples of this transformation across wildlife rescue stories. In Alaska, a polar bear once brought to a sanctuary after being stranded on melting sea ice took months before allowing staff to get near. The first time she accepted food directly from a keeper's hand. It marked not just survival, but a bridge built between worlds. Samson's moment was similar. not dramatic but deeply symbolic. Weeks passed, and Samson's small gestures began to add up. He rolled onto his back in the grass, exposing his belly. A vulnerable posture few bears show near humans. He splashed in the pond, while Daniel watched, sending water flying like a cub at play. One evening, Claire sat reading outside the enclosure when Samson walked closer, stopping only a few feet from the fence. He didn't growl or pace. He simply lay down as if her presence soothed him. Trust is not given. It is earned piece by piece. In animal rescue, progress isn't measured in leaps but in inches. A paw print closer than yesterday. A glance that lingers instead of darting away. Those inches become miles over time. What shifts inside an animal when trust begins? We can't ask Samson what he felt when he allowed Daniel to stand nearby. Was it curiosity, relief, or something deeper? Science can explain behavior patterns, but it cannot measure the quiet moment when fear softens into acceptance. That is where storytelling steps in to honor the unseen change that facts alone cannot capture. One evening captured this transformation in a way words can barely hold. Daniel had left food by the pond, then sat quietly on a bench nearby. Samson approached, ate slowly, then instead of retreating, walked closer. He stopped within a few feet, lowered his head, and nudged Daniel's arm through the fence. It was brief, almost hesitant, but unmistakable. Daniel later said, "That was the first time he touched me by choice." I'll never forget it. For viewers, here's a fresh perspective. We often imagine strength as control, the ability to dominate, to hold power. But Samson's journey shows another form of strength, the courage to let go of fear, to risk connection after abandonment. That kind of trust is fragile and rare, yet more powerful than force. It transforms not just the animal, but the human who receives it. The bond continued to grow. Samson began to follow Daniel's routine, appearing near the fence when he heard the man's boots on gravel. He accepted enrichment toys, rolling barrels across the ground while Claire laughed softly nearby. He rested in open view instead of hiding in the trees. Each milestone reminded the couple that this was no longer a bear waiting to die in a cage. This was a survivor relearning life. And perhaps the lesson extends beyond animals. Many people carry scars of their own losses, betrayals, moments that left them cautious. Samson's story whispers that healing is possible not through sudden leaps, but through small, steady steps. Trust can return even when it seemed lost forever. The transformation of trust didn't erase Samson's wildness, nor should it. He remained a grizzly bear, powerful, unpredictable, worthy of respect. But the walls that once separated him from care were thinning. He no longer lived only in defense. He began to live in connection. By the time months passed, staff who visited noticed the difference instantly. The bear who once huddled in silence now moved with calm confidence. His eyes, once dulled, reflected alertness. His body carried new strength. The most telling sign wasn't his health or his playfulness. It was the way he chose presence over hiding, the way he allowed himself to be seen. And so Samson's journey from despair to trust became not just his own story, but a mirror for everyone watching online. Thousands who had followed his rescue saw updates of him playing resting and nudging Daniel's arm. They recognized in those images a truth they carried themselves: trust can be rebuilt. What comes after trust? That is where the meaning of Samson's story broadens. It is no longer only about one grizzly bear. It becomes about how his transformation reflects the choices we face as humans, whether we extend care only when convenient or whether we allow it to ripple outward, shaping how we live with all wild animals. Samson's journey could have ended in a cage forgotten and unseen. Instead, it became a story thousands carried with them. But his transformation isn't just about one grizzly bear in Wyoming. It's about what happens when compassion ripples outward, changing not only an animal's life, but also the lives of people who choose to care. For Daniel and Claire, adopting Samson reshaped their daily rhythm. Daniel found purpose again in retirement, rising each morning to prepare food, repairing fences, observing the bear he once thought he'd only see in the wild. Claire said she began to measure her days not by school schedules, but by the quiet moments Samson allowed her presence. Their bond wasn't ownership, it was stewardship. That distinction matters. Here's the explanation. Adoption in the context of wild animals differs from the way we think about shelter dogs or cats. It is less about bringing an animal into a home and more about creating a home for the animal. Samson was not brought into a living room. He was given space to live as a grizzly while still being protected. This is what separates adoption from possession. It's a principle that extends to domestic animals too. The goal is not to mold them into our expectations, but to honor who they are. One example highlights the contrast. A family once purchased a wolf dog from a breeder, imagining it would behave like a loyal pet. Within months, they surrendered it after realizing it retained wild instincts. The animal ended up at a sanctuary, where it finally had the environment it needed. The lesson here is sharp. Buying animals often feeds demand that disregards their true needs, while adoption redirects care to those who already exist and already need help. Samson's story reminds us that adoption is not about acquisition, it is about responsibility. Beyond adoption itself, Samson's story shows the unexpected power of viral media. A simple photo shared with a few words shifted the course of his life. Donations poured in sanctuaries reconsidered, and one couple stepped forward with courage. In a world often overwhelmed with noise, it's easy to dismiss likes and shares as shallow. But when tied to real action, they can become lifelines. The fresh perspective here is that social media, often criticized for distraction, can also be a tool for rescue. A modern echo of word-of-mouth storytelling that once connected villages. Yet we cannot ignore the parallel stories. While Samson found a home, another grizzly in the same shelter never made the headlines. Without attention, resources never came and his fate was sealed quietly. This is the uncomfortable truth. Compassion, while powerful, is uneven. It flows where the spotlight shines. The responsibility of those who tell stories, shelters, sanctuaries, and yes, creators, is to widen that spotlight to ensure more lives step out of the shadows. When you share an animal rescue video, you're not only helping one story, you're supporting the possibility that other stories less visible might gain momentum too. Every viewer becomes part of the chain. Compassion scales not through one act alone, but through the willingness to pass it forward. Samson's healing also carried a reflection for the humans around him. Claire once admitted, "In saving him, I think he saved us too." Many who adopt animals, whether a shelter cat, a rescued dog, or even a displaced grizzly, find this reciprocity. The act of caring draws out parts of ourselves. We forget patience, gentleness, presence. In a culture that moves fast and often values productivity over stillness, caring for another being teaches a different rhythm. It asks us to slow down and notice. The mystery woven into Samson's story is not just how he adapted, but how he changed those who watched him. Thousands of people followed updates online. They saw his first steps, his naps by the pond, his nudges of trust, and in seeing many wrote about their own healing. One woman shared, "I lost my husband last year. Watching Samson find peace gave me hope I could too." Another man commented, "I've been estranged from my family. This bear reminded me it's never too late to rebuild trust." The bear became more than himself. He became a symbol of resilience that crossed human lives. For viewers, here's the perspective to carry forward. Samson's story is not an isolated miracle. It is a mirror. It asks us whether we treat animals and people as disposable when they no longer fit neatly into our lives, or whether we are willing to do the harder work of creating space for them to heal. Adoption, rescue, and sanctuary are not only about animals, they are about our values as humans. And so the story extends beyond one grizzly bear in a Wyoming enclosure. It stretches into every decision we make. Do we secure our trash to avoid drawing bears near? Do we choose adoption over buying when seeking a pet? Do we pause to share a story that might inspire someone else to act? These choices may look small, but they are the building blocks of a culture that either preserves life or lets it fade unseen. Samson's survival shows that even when the odds are thin, compassion can prevail. But it also challenges us not to stop at one success. The call is to keep caring, keep sharing, keep choosing responsibility over convenience. That is how one bear's transformation can ripple far beyond his enclosure. As Samson settled into his new life, his story was no longer only about survival. It had become about continuity, about the way his journey connected past to present sorrow, to hope and despair, to healing. And the question now was, what would the lasting impact be? How would his life continue to inspire after the headlines faded? Months passed, and Samson grew into himself again. The bear who once crouched in silence now walked with steady strength across his enclosure. Each morning Daniel placed food at the station, and each morning Samson met him at the fence, not with fear, but with calm recognition. Claire often sat nearby with a book, and Samson would lie down within sight, the quiet rhythm of their lives intertwining. The transformation was visible, but the deeper change was something felt rather than seen. One evening captured this better than any photo. Samson had eaten and wandered near the pond. Instead of retreating to the trees, he walked to the fence where Daniel stood waiting. He lowered his massive head, pressed it gently against the bars, and stayed there. No growl, no hesitation, just contact, a silent acknowledgement of trust. Daniel placed his hand near the fence, not to pet, but to honor the moment. For a man who had spent decades guiding others to respect wildlife, this was the most profound encounter of his life. Here's the explanation. Emotional payoffs in rescue stories are not about perfect endings. They're about proof that change is possible, that despair can shift into connection. Samson did not become tame, nor should he have. He became whole again, and in that wholeness he allowed others to share space with him. That is what made his journey powerful. Consider an example from another rescue. A black bear named Hope in North Carolina had been chained for years before being brought to a sanctuary. For months, she wouldn't step onto grass, only pacing the concrete corners of her pen. Then one day she ventured onto the dirt, rolled in it, and let out a sound like a sigh. Visitors wept as they watched. The lesson is universal. Healing is not instant, but when it comes, it restores not only the animal, but everyone who witnesses it. Samson's sigh came in nudges, splashes, naps in the sun, each a reminder that life was returning. Knowledge grows from these stories. Sanctuaries across the U.S. show that when communities act together, even endangered animals and rare animals like grizzly bears, polar bears, or black bears can find safety. Social media may seem small, but Samson's photo proved that wildlife rescue is no longer limited to professionals. It's something the public can influence. Each share, each donation, each conversation contributes to the survival of wild animals in a world where habitats shrink daily. His story demonstrates the link between our choices and their futures. And yet there's mystery here too. What did Samson think when he pressed his head against the fence? Did he feel gratitude or simply comfort? We cannot know, but perhaps that is not the point. The real takeaway is that trust itself existed, a bridge formed where none was expected. That bridge carried meaning across species, across screens, across lives. Samson's journey is not only about saving one bear. It's about how his presence reshaped the people who stepped forward. Daniel and Claire found purpose in their later years. Strangers online found hope for their own losses. A sanctuary movement found proof that the public would rally when given the chance. Samson was the catalyst, but the transformation belonged to everyone who chose to care. For you, the viewer, the invitation is not to adopt a grizzly bear. It's to reflect on your own life. Where have you stopped believing anyone would care? Where have you, like Samson, folded into yourself, waiting in silence? And where can you take your own first steps back into trust? Just as one photo stirred thousands, one choice from you to forgive, to reach out, to help, can ripple further than you imagine. Maybe it starts small, securing your trash so forest animals stay safe, supporting an animal sanctuary, or choosing adoption when you bring a pet into your life. Maybe it starts even closer, calling a family member, showing up for a friend, or offering kindness to a stranger. Samson's story reminds us that compassion is not limited to cages and enclosures. it is a way of living. The emotional payoff is simple but profound. A bear once abandoned now lives in peace. A family once searching for meaning now carries it daily. And a community of strangers who shared a photo discovered that their collective care could change the course of a life. The story is complete, but the journey is not. Because every day in every shelter, animals are waiting. Every day people are waiting too. The question is whether we choose to notice. So I leave you with this. What part of Samson's story spoke to you? Was it the despair that mirrored your own struggles? The trust that reminded you that healing is possible, or the collective compassion that showed you how powerful we become when we act together? If this journey touched you, don't let it stop here. Reflect on your own life, on the places where trust needs rebuilding, where compassion needs action. And if you want to walk with us through more stories of wild animals, animal rescue, and the rare animals that remind us of our shared world, join this community. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let's keep these stories alive together, because Samson's journey doesn't end at the fence. Neither does yours.